again, for immersion, for ritual impurity, for tumah, then ultimately again you're tamei. Why? Shecheskas tamei tamei, v'cheskas tar tar. Because at the end of the day, Allah Moshe Sinai essentially says that when there is tumas tahom, essentially whatever your previous state was, that's the state which remains. Good. That's the case of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is just illustrating, thank you. The Mishnah is just illustrating two different cases. Tumah Yedua, Tumas Tom. Beautiful. Let's go. Says the Gemara. Case at Yarad. Safa, Eino Metame Le'inyan Sharis. That says interesting. So remember again, the illustration of the case of Tumah Yedua, right, is not a typical illustration, right? Because remember again, how does the Mishnah illustrate Tumah Yedua? The corpse is floating on the top of the water. The Gemara just points out over here, floating Tumah is only a problem by Tumas Meis. It is not a problem by Tumas Sheretz. By Tumas Sheretz. Then I will say, what does that mean? That if you see a floating sheretz, actually take a quick look at Rashi. He says, Safa, 3 lines up from the bottom. Safa inu metame le'inyan sheretz, kilomar afagav de tumas meis safa metame b'safek maga. That's right, if you have a floating corpse, so that's tame b'safek, like we saw in the Mishnah. Kidisnan, kinimtza meis safa pnei mayim le'inyan sheretz, Miha eino chashuva l'tamei misafek. Shim sharetz saf apnei amayim safek nogabo. Safek lo nogabo sfek otar. So Rabbi says incredibly important. If you have a floating dead sheretz and it's a safek, did you touch it? Didn't you touch it? It does not convey tumah. So even though again a floating corpse, safek was there contact, not contact. Safek was there ohel, not ohel. Ultimately again, will pose a problem of tumah. Safek floating tumas sheretz wasn't good English, right? But again, if you have safek floating sheretz, whether or not you came in contact with it, no tumah. We'll say, by the way, I know we see these cases and we're like, okay, what am I doing here? What is it? I will say, but understand again in times of Beis Hamikdash, where tumah and tara plays a major role. So again, these halachos are incredibly important. So listen to this. So I'll say, where do we know this from? This Sanya. Safek tumah safa. So I'll say if you have a safek tumah, floating tumah, bein bekalim, bein bekarka tahora. Whether ultimately again the tumah is floating, right? Karka, let's work backwards. Karka means in the water itself, right? Kalim means if it's floating in a kli. So I will say. So remember again the typical case of floating tumah. So I just want to point out what's happening over here. We have two cases right now of floating tumah, right? Case number one is a corpse. That was the case of the Mishnah. So I'll say, if you're unsure, if you came in contact with a floating corpse, what's the halacha? Tamei. And now what the Gemara is introducing me to is, if there's a safek, if I came in contact with a floating sheretz, what's the halacha? Tar. So now the Bryce expands on this a little bit. The Bryce says as follows: Safek tumat safa. Let's say there's a safek floating tumah. Right? Did you come in contact with floating tumah or not? Now we'll say, now where is the tumah? Bein bekalim, whether it's in a kli and the kli is floating, bein bekarka, or ultimately I will say in this context means karka means what? The water itself. Tahora. Ultimately again, one is tahar. Now what's the reason for this? Rabbi Shimon Omer. So Rabbi Shimon says, bekalim temeya bekarka tahor. Rabbi Shimon says, no. If the tumah is floating in a kli, it's going to be tamei. But if the tumah is floating in the water itself, it's going to be tar. Now I will say, this tumas sheretz now. Tumas sheretz. So I will say, so where do we know this? From top of Samach Daled. My time at the Tanakama. I will say, what's the Tanakama's logic? That whether the tumah is floating in the water or whether the tumah is floating in a kli, ultimately again it's going to be tar. On Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, we'll say top line Samach Daled on Daf 64a. On Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdumi, ksiv b'chol sheretz hashoretz. The pasuk says on one hand, where does a sheretz convey tumah? Anywhere it shoretz, right? Anywhere, ultimately, again, it crawls. Which sounds like I will say that's what? That a sheretz has the ability to convey tumah where? Anywhere. But yet it also says what? That it says uksiv al haaretz, but then it says on the earth. So we'll say, so which one is it? Is a sheretz, essentially I will say, when the pasuk says b'chol sheretz hashoretz, wherever it crawls, that sounds like wherever a sheretz is, it has the ability to convey tumah. Ala aretz sounds like it only has the ability to convey tumah on the earth, on land. So by the way, when we say on land also includes what? floating in the water, right? So which one is it? Which the Gemara says, "Ha-ketzad vaday mago tame." They will say, if you know that you definitively came in contact with a sheretz, then ultimately, again, a sheretz has the ability to convey tumah. How? Right? Or through contact? Anywhere. So you touch a sheretz on land, you touch a sheretz on the water, you touch a dead sheretz in the air, right? However you touch it, right? If you know that there was confirmed contact, you are tameh. On the other hand, safek mago tar. I will say, the Tanakama holds that if there's a safek, whether or not you came in contact ultimately again with the sheretz, then safek mago sheretz is always going to be tahar, no matter what, where that potential contact took place. So I'll say, this is the position of the Tanakama. The only time that sheretz poses a problem is when there is vaday mago, definitive contact. And if there is definitive contact, where you touch that sheretz, at the end of the day, is irrelevant. Conversely, if there's safek maga, you're not sure if you touch that sheretz or not. Salach l'maisa, that case is always going to be tar. Fine. Rabbi Shimon, my time. What's Rabbi Shimon's logic? Remember again, Rabbi Shimon said, if you have safek maga sheretz, and the sheretz is in a kli, ultimately again, tameh, but if the sheretz is on the karka, tar. What's his logic? Amar ula ksiv ach mayan uksiv yitma. Shabbos says it's very interesting. So on one hand, the pasuk, just to quote you, the Gemara's quoting the pasuk, ach mayan ubar mikva ma'im yatar. I will say by like a spring of water or a well, ultimately it will be tar. V'nogeh benivla sam yitma. But one who touches an avela, a carcass, ultimately again will be tameh. So we'll say, so what's going on in the pasuk? Watch this. Ha-ketzad, safa b'kelim tameh. If the sheretz is floating in a kli, but it's on a body of water, and you're safek whether or not you touch that sheretz, ultimately again, you'll be tameh. B'karkatar, but if the sheretz itself ultimately again is on the karka, we'll say, or in this case, floating on the water itself, and you're unsure, did you touch it or not? Halacha l'maisa, again, you will be tahar. So we'll say fundamental machlokes between the Tanakama ultimately again and Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, we'll point out to you that the Rambam paskins like the Tanakama. And therefore, when it comes to Tumas Sheretz, we'll say, the only time that Tumas Sheretz poses a problem is when there's Vaday Maga, right? Ultimately, again, definitive contact. And when there is definitive contact, wherever that contact took place, right? Ultimately, again, on the water, on the land, in the air, in a kli, it doesn't matter. If there was definitive contact, there's Tumah. But I will say, the Rambam paskins that whenever there's a safek Maga by Sheretz, right? Ultimately, again, possible contact. So safek, was there contact, was there not contact? Tar. Good. So let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Tan Rabbanon. Kalani talin vani grarin sveikan tame. Well, this is really very interesting cases. Listen to this. Literally translated, anything that's carried or dragged, sveikan tame. I will say, what's the case over here? Take a look at the Rush. The Rush is in the left-hand column, right to the beginning of the Rush. Kalani talin vani grarin. Listen to what it writes. Im natal sharetz biyado. If a person took a sharetz in his hand, o gorro ba'aretz. Right? Or he dragged it on the earth. Eitzel tohoros. So we'll say, here's the case. In this case over here, a person is carrying a sheretz, or a person is dragging a sheretz. So we'll say, so in this case, there's definitive contact, right, between the person and the sheretz. What's the safek? The safek was the person, let's say, is dragging the sheretz or carrying the sheretz next to taras, right? Pure items, truma, let's say, right? So we'll say, now what's the shaila? The shaila is, did the sheretz come in contact with the taras? That's the fundamental question over here. Safek naga, safek lo naga. So Rosh says, sveikan tameh, delo chashiva tumat safa, kevan shubiyad adan. Rabbi saying, now watch this. So you see what's different? So in the previous case, we were talking about, again, did the sheretz come in contact with the person or not? That was a safek. In this case, Ruvain is dragging a sheretz. He's dragging a sheretz. He happens to pass by truma. What's the safek over here? What's the safek? Did the sheretz touch the truma or not? So we'll say, what's the halacha? I'll call it nitalman igrarin sveikan tameh. We'll say in this case, safek is tameh. Why? Mipnei shehein kimunachin. They will say, because this is not considered to be a case of tsafa. this is not considered to be a case of floating tuma, because since ultimately, again, a person is holding the sheretz, it's as if the sheretz is actually at rest. Van is rakin, but conversely, Abba said, listen to this: if you threw a sheretz and you're not sure, Abba said, what's the concern over here? Did the sheretz potentially again go over taras? Did it touch taras in its trajectory? So if it was thrown, sfeik on tar. Ultimately, what's in this case, a suffix will be tar. So, right? So suffix contact with a thrown sheretz, ultimately again will be tar. Again, about say, if you look at the rush again, Van is rakin im zarkan ba'avir eitzel taras afa pisha ba mikoach adam chashuv tumat safa. Rabbi say, see what's happening over here? Remember, how do we paskin? Any Rambam paskins, any time there's a suffix contact with floating sheretz. What's talacha? Tahar, right? Tahar. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, right? So therefore, the Gemara is just pointing out over here is a thrown sheretz is considered to be floating sheretz. A dragged sheretz or a carried sheretz is not considered to be floating sheretz. It's considered to be stationary sheretz. Well, suffix tuma with stationary sheretz is going to be tameh. Incredible. So the Gemara says chutz. The only exception to this is chutz min kizayis min hames. I will say if you have a kizayis of a corpse, and I will say now in this case over here, v'amahil al pnei tuma, or if there's a suffix, if someone hovered over tuma. So we'll see, if you look at the Rush, once again, very quickly, the Rush says over here, chutz mikizais min ameis, shezarko, safek hel al taros tmeim, the taros tuma safa mikrais. So let's listen to this. So the only exception to this is as follows. Even though we just said before that Allah might say if you throw a sheretz, right? If you throw tuma, so ultimately again that's considered to be tumat safa. That's considered to be floating tuma, and therefore again it's tahar. The exception to this is kizayis min ameis. Right? If you throw a kizayis min ameis, and there's a suffix after it was thrown, did it hover over taros or come in contact with taros? That is going to be resolved stringently. That's going to be considered to be tamei. V'amaya al pnei tuma. So we're going to say if there's a suffix as to whether or not I hovered over tuma. Those cases will be resolved ultimately stringently. As well, we'll say what else are we stringent with? Any type of tuma that has the ability to convey tuma from top down. Milamala kilamata. I will say that comes to include a case of what? Of zav and zava. So I will say what's the case of zav and zava? Remember again, zav has this interesting halacha where if a zav sits on a pile of cushions, what's the halacha? Ultimately, the entire pile is going to go ahead and become tummy. So if you have a suffix in a case like that, that suffix will also be resolved stringently. So I will say, let's go with what we know. So what do we know so far? Some very interesting facts are emerging from this discussion. So fact number one, I will say, the way we paskin is tumas sheretz safa, or tumas sheretz safa, floating tumas sheretz, and you're not sure ultimately again, did you touch it or not? What's the halacha? Tahar. That's a pass like Drabanan. That's pass like Drabanan. So I'll say that's case number one. Right? Case number two, I'll say is tumas sheretz that is being carried or being dragged, and a suffix whether or not that sheretz touched taros. What's the halacha? Tameh. Why? Because carried or dragged sheretz is like what? Stationary sheretz. Good. Fact number two. Right? So we'll say again, right? Those are primary facts. However, thrown sheretz, right? Thrown sheretz, nizrakin, has the same status as what? Floating sheretz, and therefore suffix contact, ultimately, if you're not sure if it came in contact or not, will be resolved leniently. There are exceptions to the thrown rule, tumas akzais minamis, but we're going to leave that on the side. Fine, let's go weiter. Let's see, here we go. Some really interesting cases over here. Meis bekli, we'll say, watch this. So now remember again, what about the following situation? Let's say you have a mace, either a corpse itself or a piece from a corpse, that is floating in a utensil. All right, it's in a utensil, and the utensil is floating in the water. So I will say, so Mahu, what is the halacha? What is the halacha in a case like this? Now I will say, now take a look, by the way, before we go on, take a look at the Rush. So the Rush says, Meis bikli uklit safa gabi amayim viaduahu shlohir alav umisafkale im naga im lo naga So now watch this. Watch this. Here's the case. There's a corpse in a kli. A corpse in a kli. The Rosh says, by the way, it could be a corpse in a kli, or it could be ultimately, again, it could be a sheretz in a kli. The shaila is the same. So the corpse, right? We'll say, let's actually go with the sheretz, because it's more exciting with the sheretz, because we just learned this. We'll say, what's the halacha with tumat safa by a sheretz? What's the halacha? Floating sheretz. What's the halacha? You're not sure, did you come in contact with it or not? What's the halacha? Tahar, right? Because again, we're lenient with floating sheretz. We'll say, this is great. So we'll say, so now what happens if the sheretz is floating in a kli? Right? Remember again, typical floating sheretz. What is the sheretz floating on? Nothing, it's in the water. Now the sheretz is on a kli, floating in the water. I'm not sure, did I come in contact with it or not? What's the halacha? So we'll say, this is such a great question. Right? We'll say, what's the shaila? Mao, basar kli azlinon, o basar misa azlinon. I will say, what's the shaila? This is so riveting. The shaila is, when I look at that sheretz, I will say, how do I view it? Do I look at the sheretz as stationary or as floating? Let's work backwards. Why would I look at it as floating? It's in water. Why would I look at it as stationary? It's in a kli. So I'll say, you hear the shaila? Right? It's a definitional shaila. On one hand, the sheretz is floating. It's on the water. But it's not floating directly on the water, it's floating in a kli. So is this a stationary sheretz, or is this a floating sheretz? I will say, now you'll see before you came to share today, if somebody would have asked you this question, you would have said, who cares, right? It makes no difference, leave me alone, right? Now I will say, now I realize it makes a world of difference. Why? Because a floating sheretz, safek maga, is tahar. Safek maga sounds like a political movement, right? Right. So safek maga, right? So I'll say, so ultimately again, right? So lemaisa, safek maga on floating sheretz is tar. Safek maga on stationary sheretz is tameh. So now both say, so now I have the sheretz in a kli on the water. So how do I look at it? Is it floating sheretz or ultimately stationary sheretz? In other words, do I judge the position of the sheretz vis-a-vis the water or vis-a-vis the kli? Okay, so Gemara says, Imtim Salomar. Now, we're going to build a whole bunch of questions, one on top of the other. Imtim Salomar, Basar Kli Azlina. So we'll say, if you say we go after the kli, and therefore, again, this is considered to be a stationary sheretz, Basar Kli Azlinon, Meis al Gabi sheretz mahu. We'll say, watch this. What happens if you have a corpse, or a piece of a corpse, kizais min meis even, on top of a sheretz, right? So we'll say, now watch this. You've got a sheretz floating on the water, and then a kizayis maze on top of the sheretz. Now watch this, we'll say, mahu, what's the halacha? Kevan dahai tumas erev, dahai tumas shiva. So we'll say, look, obviously, two different types of tumah. Remember, if you come in contact with the sheretz, that is only a one-day tumah. So do we, and remember again, coming in contact with the dead, with the corpse, obviously is a 7-day tumah. So the Gemara says, the high tumah serva, high tumah shiva, kiman dimachto tumah b'kli damya. So we'll say, maybe because they're two dissimilar types of tumah, we view the kizais min hameis like it's sitting in a kli. Like it is sitting in a kli, right? We'll view the sheretz like the kli, and therefore the mace is sitting in a kli, and therefore again, maybe the mace is stationary. Or maybe I will say what? Or maybe it's just what? Considered to be one thick form of tumah. Okay? So the Gemara says, Vimtim salomar, kiman demachto tumah b'kli damya. I will say, and if you want to go with the premise, that what? That when you have the kizayis min hameis sitting on top of a sheretz floating in the water, we view the kizayis min hameis as if it's sitting in a kli, and therefore stationary. And therefore any safek contact with that kizayis min hameis will be dealt with stringently. So now listen to this. So the Gemara says, Kiman demachto tumah b'kli damya, v'tamei vadai, sheretz al gabe nevela. Ooh, interesting. I will say, what happens if you have a piece of sheretz floating on top of a piece of nevela in the water? So we'll say, what's the halacha over here? Mahu. So do we say, Kevan de tarvaihu tumas erev inun tumas michtihi? Now we'll say, in this case, as opposed to the previous case, where you have tumas mace floating on sheretz. So we'll say, why in the case of tumas mace floating on sheretz can you view this sheretz as a kli for the mace? Why is that? Because there are two distinct forms of tumah. Well, what about if you have sheretz floating on nevela? The Rabbi say halachically, sheretz and nevela are pretty much the same thing. Why? Because they're both one day tumah. So maybe Rabbi say maybe because they both have the same the same type of tumah, it's just considered to be one thick piece of tumah, and therefore this is considered to be a suffix floating tumah. Ol dilma high kizais high kadasha. But on the other hand, they are distinct. Why are they distinct? Because we'll say the tumah of sheretz could be even, remember again, it's on a sheretz of any type of size, even a minuscule sheretz, the size of a lentil, versus tumas nevela, which is only what? A kizayis. Maybe since they have two different shurim, they're distinct enough to say that the nevela should be like the kli for the sheretz. I will say, right? So fine. If that's the case, I will say it gets more exciting. Sheretz al gabe sheretz. I will say, wow, what happens if you have a sheretz floating on top of another sheretz? So what's the halacha? Mau hani vadechat shiruninu. So we'll say on one hand, right? It's one shear. So we'll say, remember again, our fundamental shaila we'll say is, and now you see it really does make a world of difference. How do you view one type of tumah floating on another type of tumah? Is it considered to be like the top tumah is in a kli, and therefore stationary, and therefore suffix contact with it makes the person tumah, or not? It's just considered to be all floating tumah. Some will say, not the last case yet, we have sheretz on top of sheretz floating. Now we'll say, so what's the halacha over here? Now obviously, hani vadei chad shiuraninu. So we'll say, obviously, it's all the same shear, because it's sheretz and sheretz. O dilma, kevan de mifsiki mehadadi lo. Or maybe not. Maybe because they're two separate entities. Then what Rabbi said, since they're two separate entities, so halacha l'maisa, the bottom sheretz could serve as a kli for the upper sheretz, and therefore this is a case of stationary sheretz, not floating sheretz. Vim tim salomar, sheretz al gabi sheretz. So I will say, maybe you'll say like this. Maybe even when one sheretz is floating on another sheretz, kevan demifski me'adadi, since they're separate entities, kiman demancha bekli dami. Ultimately, again, it is as if the upper sheretz is resting in a utensil. Sheretz al gabi nevela shilimichu. Oh, all right. Watch this. What about a sheretz that's resting on dissolved nevela? Dissolved nevela. So we'll say, what's the halach over here? Mau, kevan dinimucha havile mashke. So we'll say, maybe we'll say, look, you know what dissolved nevela is? I mean, gross, right? But right? Right? Dissolved nevela, we'll say, is liquid, right? So maybe since it's liquid, clearly again, the sheretz is floating. Odama, hai ochluhu. Oh no, but we'll say on the other hand, no, we're not going to call dissolved nevela water. It's not going to be mine. Why? Because it's still food. So maybe because it's still food, since it's supporting the sheretz, it's enough to say that the sheretz is in a kli. Now we'll say, here we go. Sheretz al gabi shichva zera. All right, now it's a party, right? So I'll say, so now, right? So now what happens over here? So I'll say, so now let's say you have, again, I will say, you understand, we're just trying to figure out, so I will say, what's the definition of stationary versus what's the definition of floating? So I'll say, so what happens if you have sheretz floating on top of shichva zera? So I will say, what's the halacha in this case over here? Mau, imtim salomar, kevan demis akra, haviki uchla. Now, I'll say, let's understand this phrase. Since it's separate from the body, ultimately it's uchla. And I'll say, uchla literally means food. It's not suggesting that shechva zera, that semen, is food. What it's saying over here is, maybe when something becomes a separate and distinct entity, it's looked at as a separate and distinct entity. So therefore, if you have a sheretz floating on top of shichvas zera, so the sheretz is considered to be in a kli. Since the shichvas zera itself is its own independent entity, therefore halacha l'maisa, the sheretz is considered to be at rest, and therefore any suffix contact with the sheretz is again going to be ruled tameh. Sheretz, therefore again, follow-up question will be, sheretz agabe mechatos. So let's listen to this. What happens if you have a sheretz floating on top of mechatos? I will say mechatos is paraduma water, right? Paraduma water. So imagine you have the mixture of mechatos, it's floating on the water. Sheretz is floating on top of that. Umechatos safon agabe mayim. I will say now the mechatos, the paraduma water itself, is floating on top of the water. Mahu. Ultimately, you want to say what's talach? So I will say, so now question upon question upon question. What does the Gemara answer? Lo yadinan tegu. We don't know. So again, I'll say what it really comes down to is a fun. Obviously, I want to point out, what do you do again in these cases that you don't know? So generally, again, although they're not all resolved the same way, but generally they'll be resolved stringently. So I'll say, really this gets into a fundamental definition. Here's what we do know. What I do know is that halacha l'maisa, if there's a suffix contact with floating sheretz, that is resolved leniently. But if a sheretz ultimate suffix contact with a we'll call it grounded sheretz, ultimately again will be tamei. What this Gemara is just trying to figure out over here is what happens if something is floating on top of something else. Do we consider the item to be at rest, grounded, right, since it is contained in something else, or no, since ultimately it's floating on top of the water, albeit with a separation from the water, it's considered to be at rest. So I will say that tension the Gemara does not resolve. Pretty fascinating. Good. I will say Amud Beis says the Gemara Amar Hamnuna Nazir va'oseh Pesach. So I will say, so switching gears a little bit over here. Nazir va'oseh Pesach shahalchu bekever hatom b'shvi shalayim. So we'll say, let's go. Let's finish up the Amud. Right, because we don't have the luxury of falling. We have a little bit. We can fall behind a little bit. So, Nazir va'oseh Pesach shahalchu bekever hatom b'shvi shalayim. We'll say, very interesting case. You have a Nazir, right? So, or somebody going to offer up carbon Pesach. Now, we'll say, in these individuals, they were tamei. And now what happens? It's the 7th day of their purification process. So we'll say it's a very straightforward case. So you have a Nazir who became tamei. How did he become tamei? He came in contact with a corpse. What's the process for becoming purified from a corpse? What's the process? 7-day purification process. Fine. He goes to a 7-day purification process. He's at the tail end of it. It's day number 7. And what ends up happening? He comes in contact with tumas tahom. That's the case. So I'll say, now remember, how does that play out? The way it plays out, I will say, is, right, it's day number 7. He ends up, let's just keep it simple, he ends up walking over a grave that no one knew about, okay? Now I will say, when does the Nazir, let's keep with Nazir. When does the Nazir find out about it? When does he find out about it? Now remember again, I will say, the Nazir has no idea. Remember, what is he, just to be clear, Reuven is a Nazir. Reuven came in contact with a corpse. He knew about it, right? So what does that do? It's so ser, the Nazirus up until now. He goes through the purification process, does his shaving, and then what? Restarts again. He restarts again. Let's say now he does his Neder Nazirus, another 30 days. He concludes his Neder Nazirus. After he concludes his Neder Nazirus, he finds out that what? That he was exposed to Tumas Tahom on the 7th day of the purification process from his Nazirus B'tumah. See, he's already done. Look at the Rosh just a moment. The Rosh says, Amar Famnuna, Nazir va'oseh Pesach shalcho b'kever tom b'zayin shalan, ki go Nazir shenitma v'hiza v'shana v'taval, ubo b'yom over al kever tom, v'lo nodalo at shehishlim niziruso, v'hevi karbanosam. So I will say, in this case over here, the Nazir only finds out about the exposure to the Tumas Tom when? He's done. Right? His Nazirus is a distant memory. He's done already. But then he finds out that on the 7th day of the purification process, that what? That Lamaisa, he was exposed to Tumah. So I will say, what happens in this case? So what's Talacha? Tahorim. Ultimately, again, they're Tahar. My time, what's the reason? The lo alima tumas hatom lemister. Because Rabbi say tumas tahom ultimately again is not strong enough to go ahead and undo the purification process once it's already on its last day. So Rabbi say the Gemara is introducing us to something a little bit different over here. So Rav Hamnuna is saying is exposure to tumas tahom sometimes can undermine, but if the exposure takes place on the 7th day of the purification process, which is what Rabbi say, which is what? The last day of the purification process, Tumas Tahom cannot undermine the Tara process when the Tara process has already reached its final stage, i.e. day number 7. That's Rav Hamnuna's thesis statement. Massive Rava says, 1 second, look at the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? Yarad litar metumas hames. Tameh. It will say, but our Mishnah doesn't say that. Right? Remember again, what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says if you have a person, presumably again, it could be even Nazir Tameh, who went into the cave to go ahead and what? To immerse for his tumah, and then he finds out later on that what? That there was a dead body buried in the earth of the cave. What's the halacha? If he went in tamei, he remains tamei. Now we'll say, that could even be a 7th day immersion. So that's a case of Tumas Tahom on day number 7, and yet Rabbi say, what is the Mishnah saying? What is the Mishnah saying? It does make a person tamei. So Rav is contradicting Rav Hamnuna. Amarle, ultimately, Rav Hamnuna will say, Modina lacha b'nazir shemuchusra taglachas. I would agree with you in a case, ultimately, again, if we're talking about Tumah exposure, before the Nazir took his haircut, then I will agree with you that ultimately, again, exposure to Tumas Tahom before the Nazir took his haircut will go ahead and undermine his Tara. But ultimately, I will say, but remember again, what are we talking about over here? We're talking about a case over here where was the Tumas Tahom discovered? Or excuse me, when was it discovered? When was it discovered? After the Nazir finished everything. I will say, remember again, he's finding out now, after he brought his karbanos, after he did his hair cutting, he finds out now that on the day 7 of his purification process, he was exposed to Tumas Tahom. That's what Rav Hamnuna says, that's what I'm going to say, Tumas Tahom doesn't have an impact. The Mishnah's case is where he finds out about his exposure when? Before his haircut. So Rav Hamnuna says, okay, I'll agree with you in that case as well. Rava says, you know what, you're saying good. Af ana modina lacha ba'oseh Pesach. I will also agree with you in the case of Oseh Pesach, in the case of the guy who's going to do his Karban Pesach, Delo mechusra v'lo klum. Then I will say, in that case, since he's missing nothing on the 7th day of his purification process, that if he is exposed to Tumas Tahom on day number 7 of his purification process, it will not undermine the purification. So I will say, so remember again, the case of Oseh Pesach is the case of the guy who wants to do Karban Pesach. He experienced Tumas Meis. He's on the 7th day of his purification process, so that now he can go to offer up Karban Pesach. Rava will say that if that guy is exposed to Tumas Tahom on day number 7 of the purification process, Rava says, Rav Hamnuna, I'll agree with you that Tumas Tahom doesn't do anything to that guy. Why? Because since that guy is not missing anything anymore. In other words, he's already gone through all of the parts of his purification process. Exposure to Tumas Tahom on day number 7 will not undermine his purification. Amarle Abai, so 1 second, but he is missing something. Amarle Abai, v'hamu chusar harav shemesh. He is missing something. Rabbi say, remember again, even on day number 7, Rabbi say, the purification on day number 7 is not complete until when? It's not complete until when? Sunset. So he is missing purification. He is missing sunset, to which Rav will respond, Amarle Shimsha Mamela Arva. We don't view it, Rabbi say, as fascinating. On day number 7, as much as you need sunset, we don't view the absence of sunset as what? Something missing from your purification process. Why not? Because sunset will come on its own. Right? In other words, I will say, the parts of the purification process that we view as missing are parts that you have control over. Purification, right? Sunset will come. So I will say, by the way, it's a very profound statement. Which I will say, sometimes this is like the greatest chizuk. Whenever you're having a very bad day, just always remember, Shimsha Mamela Arva. The day's going to be over. It's a very important yisod. Sometimes Rabbi say, again, I have a day. I don't mean like a bad day necessarily, even just because sometimes it could be a bad day because of stuff that happened. Rabbi say, sometimes the worst days are the days that I make bad because of bad decisions that I have made. And Rabbi say, sometimes it feels like the sky is falling on those days when I've just really made some very poor life decisions. It's important to know, Shimsha Mamela Arva. The day will end. The day will end. And Rabbi say, what happens when the day ends? There's another pasuk. What's the other pasuk? Uba shemesh v'taher. Right? Rabbi say, the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh says, Ba shemesh v'taher, one of the most beautiful and incredible psukim of all time. Right? Why? Because what's Uba shemesh v'taher? The sun goes down, the day is over, and another one begins. And no matter how badly I may have messed up the previous one, new day always brings new opportunity. So Shimsha Mamela Arva, don't worry, as bad as it is, it comes to an end. Uba shemesh v'taher. Ultimately, again, new day brings untold opportunities. Well, so let's just finish up. Therefore, Abaye says that Rava responds, hair of shemesh is not considered to be something missing from the Tara process because halacha l'maisa, it occurs on its own. We'll say very quickly, even Abaye recanted on this. Tisanya, biyom malos tavi, Toch melos lo tavi. I will say just very quickly, this is talking about a woman. Remember again, a woman has a girl. If a woman gives birth to a girl, halacha lamaisa, she is tamea for 14 days, and then tahora for the next 66 days. On day number 81, she goes in and she brings a carbon. So I will say, let's say she miscarries again during the course of those days. So Yom Ulos, if she miscarries on day number 80 or day number 81, then she has to bring an additional carbon. Toch Malos lo savi. But if she goes ahead and she miscarries within the previous 80 days, she does not have to bring an additional carbon, but rather she's yotzei with the carbon she's already bringing. Yachol lo savi aleidah shalifnei malos, aval tavi aleidah shalachar malos, viti patim mishten. You might have thought that halacha lemaisa, she does not have to bring a carbon for a leida before those 80 days, but she does have to bring on a leida after. Viti patim mishten, and then she can go ahead and be yotzei, 2 births with one carbon. Talmud lomar. Tara, biyom melos tavi, only if it happened literally again on the concluding day, i.e. day number 80 or 81, right? Ultimately again, toch melos lo saros. We're going to do this quickly. Amrav Kahana, shiny hacha, it's different over here. The mechasra carbon. Ultimately, again, I will say because the melos is not completed. Ultimately, until when? Because she's missing a carbon. Hasam nami. Ayrabosa in the case of where ultimately again she miscarried on day number 81. Mechasra herav shemesh. She's also missing something herav shemesh. Amrli Abaye shimsha mamela avra. Rabbi say this whole case ultimately was just brought to show us that what when a person is tameh and they're missing sunset, the only thing they're missing from their tara process is sunset. They are not considered to be missing anything. In other words, Rabbi said the only time one is considered to be deficient in their tara process is when they're missing something over which they have control. But when the only thing I'm missing ultimately again is herav shemesh, is sunset, that's not considered to be as if there's something deficient from my tara process. Why? Shimsha b'meila arva, because the sun sets on us. Therefore, what comes out from this sugi is something very interesting, is Rav Hamnuna's idea that halacha l'maisa, exposure to tumas tahom on day number 7 of the purification process will not undermine Nazirus. As long as what? When are you discovering this piece of knowledge? When are you discovering this? Already after the fact, after you finish your hair cutting, and after you finish ultimately again your karbanos, karbanos and then hair cutting, halacha l'maisa, if you find out that you were exposed to tumas tahom way back when on the 7th day of your purification process, that exposure will not undermine your purity. Abosai, shkayach. All right, Chavra on Zoom, have a great day, everyone.